Some storms don't come to destroy us, but to take us to the only place where we can be transformed. He was swallowed by the storm, but woke up in a place that no one can explain. What if I told you that there is a miracle of Jesus that defies explanation? Something so profound, so mysterious, that even today scholars, theologians and believers try to understand. Imagine a supernatural event that not only proves divine power, but also carries a secret that few know. Something that happened in the middle of the fury of a storm, when everything seemed lost. And suddenly, the impossible happened. This story, which almost no one talks about, has a hidden detail that can change the way you see faith. It is not just another account of a miracle, but a testimony that reveals something extraordinary. A secret place, an inexplicable refuge, a divine mystery that shows us that Jesus is always in control, even when everything around us seems to fall apart. Now, imagine the scene. The wind howled as if it were a lament from the earth itself. Waves rose like gigantic walls, swallowing everything around. The sky was as dark as a starless night. The thunder broke the darkness like a heavenly scream. In the midst of this chaos, a man struggles to stand, holding on to what little he has left. He is on the edge of the abyss, about to be consumed by the raging sea. Screams of despair mix with the roar of the storm. He feels the weight of the raging waters, feels the fear spreading through every part of his being. And then, the inevitable happens. He is swallowed by the storm. But here's what no one can explain. Because instead of being destroyed, instead of drowning in despair, he awakens in a place that simply shouldn't exist. A place that defies all logic, a refuge that could only have been created by a force far greater than anything we know. This is the point where the story becomes even more impressive. Because when we look at the miracles of Jesus, we often think of healings, multiplication of food, resurrections. But what if I told you that there are miracles that go beyond our understanding? That there are divine interventions that not only transform lives, but completely defy the laws of nature. And that's exactly why you need to stay with me until the end of this video. Because what I'm going to tell you could forever change the way you see life's difficulties. Perhaps you have faced storms that seemed uncontrollable, moments when everything around you fell apart and you asked yourself, where is God now? Why am I going through this? But what if in the midst of the chaos there was something you weren't seeing? A secret location, a greater purpose that can only be revealed at the right time? This story is more than a miracle. It is a profound teaching about faith, about trust, about the certainty that even when everything seems lost, Jesus has a plan. He doesn't just calm the storms. Sometimes he allows us to be carried away by them, just to show us that there is a special place prepared for those who trust in him. This story did not come to you by chance. I know that just as happened with that man swallowed by the storm, perhaps you have already experienced moments when everything seemed lost. But if this message found you today, it's because there is something here for you. And stories like this you don't find anywhere. This channel is the only one on YouTube dedicated to revealing unknown stories about Jesus, stories that move the soul and bring new perspectives on faith. So, for this journey to continue, and for more people to discover truths that were hidden, sign up now and activate the bell. This way, you guarantee that you won't miss the next revelations to come. And of course, leave your like, because this shows that this type of content needs to reach more hearts. Now we return to the crucial moment. He was swallowed by the storm. What happened next? No one can explain, but I'll tell you. Stay with me. Night was already beginning to fall over the Sea of Galilee, and the last rays of sunlight colored the sky with golden and orange tones. For many, this was a spectacle of nature, a divine painting that announced the end of another day. But for him, it was a silent warning that he needed to return home. The cold wind blew across the surface of the water, and he knew that the night would bring with it darkness, stronger winds, and perhaps an unexpected storm. But that didn't scare him. At least, not until that day. He was a fisherman. Since he was a child, he learned to respect the sea, to read the signs of the sky, and to recognize the moods of the wind. His father had taught him that the sea was a generous friend, but also a merciless enemy to those who did not respect it. He had faced storms before. He had seen men washed away and never returned. But there was something different that night, something he couldn't explain. That day had been long. He had left with his small boat before sunrise, along with other fishermen in the region. The sea was calm that morning, and everything indicated that the fishing would be plentiful. But as the day went on, the fish seemed to disappear. They cast the nets again and again, hoping for a good school, but almost nothing came. The sun was punishing his skin, and his patience was running out. It was one of those days that tested the faith and endurance of any fisherman. As he pulled up his nearly empty net once again, he found himself thinking about his own life. Fishing was all he knew. Since he was little, he saw his father go out to sea every morning and return with the family's support. Now, he supported his house in the same way, but there was an emptiness inside him that neither the fish, nor the waters, nor hard work could fill. Maybe it was tiredness, maybe it was frustration, or maybe it was that nagging feeling that something was about to happen. Something big. In the distance, he saw movement in the city. The streets were more crowded than usual. Ever since a certain Jesus of Nazareth began teaching and performing miracles, the city had not been the same. Some people were fascinated by him, others doubted, and there were also those who were afraid. He himself didn't know what to think about it. I had heard stories about fishermen who had abandoned everything to follow him, men who dropped their nets because they believed he was the Messiah. But what if all of this were just empty words? He didn't have time for these things. He had to worry about his daily bread. But deep down, a part of him wondered, what if it were true? What if this Jesus was different from all the other prophets and teachers who had already passed through there? The sun had already completely disappeared when he decided to return home. But as soon as he started rowing toward the shore, he felt a shiver run down his spine. The wind was blowing differently. It was no longer a light breeze, but irregular gusts cutting across the surface of the water and stirring up small waves. He frowned. Something wasn't right. He looked up at the sky and noticed that dark clouds were beginning to form on the horizon. The other fishermen, realizing the same, began to rush their boats. No one wanted to stay at sea when a storm was approaching, but he was still far from shore, and his boat was small. The wind grew stronger, the waves began to grow. The noise of the sea was no longer a peaceful sound, but a frightening roar. He rowed hard, trying to maintain control of the vessel, but with every second the wind grew fiercer, and the waves seemed higher. The sky closed completely, and the first thunder broke the silence of the night. The storm was coming, and this time, he felt like it wasn't just any storm. The heart started to beat faster. He had faced the raging sea before, but he had never been alone in a situation like this. And the worst part, he was too far from the coast. If something went wrong, no one would be there to help you. The first strong wave crashed against the boat, rocking it violently. He held on tight, taking deep breaths. I needed to remain calm. But then another, bigger wave came, throwing water into the vessel. The soaked nets weighed even more, making movement difficult. The boat wasn't holding up. The storm was already completely upon him. Lightning flashes lit up the sky from time to time, showing a frightening scene. The sea was furious. Waves rose like walls. The wind whistled like a lament, and he felt a fear he had never felt before. He looked around. There was no one, just him and the sea. He shouted, trying to call someone, but his voice was swallowed by the roar of the storm. It was the end. Despair began to take over him. He tried to row, tried to hold on, but it was impossible to fight something so big. He felt his body being thrown from side to side, his hands slipping on the wet ropes. He closed his eyes for a moment and thought about everything he had experienced. Your family, your home, your days at sea. He thought about all. The times he challenged the waters and won. But now he felt like none of that mattered. And then it happened. A gigantic wave rose before him, high as a wall that blotted out the sky. It was an implacable, uncontrollable force. He didn't have time to react. The boat was thrown over the side, and he was thrown out. The impact with the freezing water was like a blow. The world spun around him. He tried to swim, but the current was pulling him under. He opened his mouth to breathe, but all he felt was the salty taste of water invading his lungs. He was being swallowed by the storm. And then, silence. Everything around him disappeared. The deafening noise of the storm disappeared. The roar of the sea ceased. The weight of the water that was dragging him disappeared. He no longer felt cold. I no longer felt afraid. What happened next? No one can explain. The cold of the water was a brutal shock against his skin. The sea swallowed him as if he had a life of his own, as if he were a hungry monster that was finally dragging its prey into the depths. He spun in the dark whirlpool, not knowing where up or down was, without control over his own body. He tried to swim, but he was pulled in all directions, like a leaf thrown in the wind. Desperation spread in his chest like fire, burning, suffocating, begging for a single breath of air. He opened his mouth to scream, but only water came in. His throat burned, his heart raced like a hurried drum, a frantic beat of someone fighting. The inevitable. He stretched his arms upward, trying to find the surface, but the ocean was pushing him down, as if invisible hands were holding him down. His body spun out of control, and every time he tried to move, the current dragged him further. Time seemed to have stopped there. Each second stretched out like an eternity as the sea pulled him into an abyss of darkness. The weight of the water pressed against his chest. His lungs begged for oxygen, but all he had was that cold emptiness. Around him, there was no more noise, there was no more thunder, nor the roar of the storm, nor the crack of the boat breaking apart. Just silence, an oppressive, frightening silence, as if the world above no longer existed. He opened his eyes, but all he saw was darkness. Only undefined shadows danced around him, as if he was sinking into an endless abyss. I didn't know where I was anymore. I didn't know where to go. I didn't know if there was still a way back. Panic gripped every part of his being. His body begged for air, and his mind screamed confusing orders. Swim, climb up, get out of here. But how? Where to? The ocean held him like it was a part of him now, and every second that passed seemed to take him further away from life. The water filled his ears, drowning out even his own thoughts. His muscles began to fail, exhaustion spread, and he realized something terrible. I was losing the fight. His body, so strong, so accustomed to heavy work, no longer obeyed. His arms were weak. Your legs are heavy. His chest burned as if he was being burned from the inside. But the worst part wasn't the physical pain. The worst thing was the feeling of being alone, completely alone. He tried calling for someone, but he knew no one would hear him. Who could rescue him there, in the middle of nowhere, in the endless darkness? The truth was brutal. No one would come. And then, in the midst of despair, his mind began to bring back memories. Fragmented visions of his life flashed before his eyes. His first day at sea, when he was still a boy and held a fishing net with his small, inexperienced hands. His father, smiling, telling him not to be afraid of the ocean, because the sea always gives back what's his. The quiet nights in the village, listening to stories around the fire. The mornings when he woke up before the sun to ensure his family's livelihood. And now, was this how it all ended? He thought about his fishing friends, who were probably already on dry land. He thought of his family, who might already be asleep, unaware that he was fighting for his life. He thought about the days when he walked the streets of the city, listening to people talk about miracles, about Jesus, about the man who transformed everything wherever he went. And where was he now? Where was God in the midst of that storm? His lungs burned like fire. His eyes began to close. The world around him began to lose shape. The shadows became blurry blurs. It was like his body was giving up, as if his soul was already separating from his flesh, giving in to the fate that the ocean seemed to have chosen for him. But there was something inside him that still resisted, something that refused to accept that end. After all, would this really be the end? Desperation and storm were now one, both outside and inside. The ocean roared, but his mind roared louder. Fear tried to suffocate him, but a small spark of something he didn't understand, fought to stay lit. But then, something happened. And what happened next? No one can explain. Now tell me, have you ever felt like you were drowning in problems, not knowing how to get out? Write, "I believe," in the comments if you believe that, even in the middle of the storm, there is something bigger holding us back. The impact of the wave was like a brutal blow, an invisible punch that knocked out what little air he had left in his lungs. The water came with an overwhelming force, spinning his body mercilessly, dragging him into the depths. He tried to resist, tried to fight the current, but it was useless. It was as if gigantic, invisible hands were pulling him down into an abyss of endless darkness. The sea wouldn't let him breathe. I didn't let him think. I just swallowed it. It spun out of control like a piece of driftwood. His arms and legs flailed, but found nothing to hold on to. The weight of the water pressed against his chest, crushing him like a rock. He opened his eyes, but all he saw was darkness, cut by small beams of light, distorted by the water. The glow of the storm above seemed distant, unreachable. Silence took over. The thunder no longer echoed. The roar of the wind, the screams of the storm, the cracks of the boat's wood being torn apart. Everything disappeared. It was as if he had been ripped from the real world and thrown somewhere else. A place where time did not exist, where the only thing left was emptiness. Only the muffled sound of his own breathing echoed in his head. But even that was becoming distant. His body continued to sink. Panic rose within him like a wave, even greater than the one that engulfed him. He needed to go up. He needed to get out of there, but what was the way? The seabed and the surface were just blurry shadows, and he no longer knew where to swim. The sea spun him around aimlessly, and his mind began to lose itself along with it. His heartbeat was fast and desperate. His chest was begging for air, his throat was burning, his head was throbbing. He tried to open his mouth to release the trapped air, but his body refused. Everything in him said he couldn't give up, that there was still a chance. But where? As time passed, but it was impossible to know how many seconds or minutes had passed since he fell. The water seemed to become denser, heavier, as if it were being swallowed not just by the ocean, but by something larger, something I couldn't see. His lungs were about to give out. The need to breathe was unbearable. He knew he couldn't hold out much longer. Everything around him started to lose focus. The shadows mixed. The distorted lights of the storm disappeared. His arms became weak. His legs no longer moved. And then everything stopped. No pain, no fear, no sensation. It was as if he wasn't there anymore. The storm had disappeared. The sea no longer seemed violent. The world around him no longer existed. But what happened next? No one can explain. Time seemed to have dissolved. The whirlwind of the storm, the weight of the waves dragging him under, the suffocating despair, everything was gone. There was no more sound, no cold, no pain, just an absolute void. A silence so profound it made it seem like he had been ripped from the world itself. Then, suddenly, a sensation invaded his body, a gentle warmth, a breath of life that ran through his lungs like a first breath after a long absence of air. Slowly, his mind began to awaken, and a question pulsed through his thoughts. did I die? He opened his eyes. The light was soft, golden, different from the blinding brightness of the Galilean sun. It wasn't like the aggressive light of lightning cutting across the sky during the storm. It was something softer, more welcoming. At first, everything was blurry, as if emerging from a deep, long sleep. He blinked a few times, trying to get his bearings, trying to understand where he was. What he saw around him didn't make sense. The ground beneath his body was firm, but it was not sand. It wasn't wood. It wasn't stone. He sat up slowly, his muscles still feeling weak, as if he had been sleeping for days. His clothes were dry, his hair was dry. But how? Minutes ago, he was in the middle of the ocean, swallowed by the fury of the waters. The heart accelerated. The first thing he did was put his hands on his chest, feeling his own body, as if he wanted to make sure he was still there, alive. Air went in and out of his lungs normally. He breathed. His heart was beating. But where was he? He looked around. The place was calm. An almost sacred silence hung in the air. There was no wind. There was no thunder. Not a drop of rain. The storm simply didn't exist anymore. The sky above was not black and furious like before. It was a serene blue, brushed with light golden nuances, as if it were always late afternoon, an eternal twilight that never gave way to night. But this was not Galilee. It wasn't the seashore where I used to fish. There were no boats, there were no nets, there were no footprints in the sand that could indicate that someone had been there before. Just that smooth, firm ground, that breeze he didn't feel, that place that seemed unreal. He stood up slowly, feeling the weight of his own body as if he were relearning how to walk. Every step was hesitant. The silence of the place bothered him. It was as if he were out of time, as if the world he belonged to had been left behind. His chest tightened with uncertainty. How had he gotten there? What happened to the storm? With the sea? He remembered the icy water covering his body, the fear that crushed him, the moment he felt like he would be swallowed up forever. He should be dead, but it wasn't. And then another question came to his mind. Who saved him? He tried to remember. He searched his memory for any clue as to what could have happened, but there was nothing. No memory, no time when he had seen a hand reach out to rescue him, no boat approaching. His heart started to beat faster. He wasn't understanding. A shiver ran down his spine. The feeling that something was wrong was growing inside him. But at the same time, there was something about that place that kept him from feeling afraid. He should have been terrified, but it wasn't. There was something there, something invisible but present, something that couldn't be explained, but that could be felt. He took a deep breath and took a few more steps. The sound of his own feet echoed faintly, as if the ground beneath him wasn't completely solid. It was a real place, but at the same time, it felt like a dream. He looked at the horizon. There was no end, no reference points, no mountains, no trees, no cities in sight. Just a void that stretched as far as his eyes could see. But it wasn't a frightening emptiness. It was a peaceful void. A thought crossed his mind and he couldn't ignore it. Could this be the place where the dead go? The idea hit him like thunder. He didn't want to believe it, but it made sense. He remembered the storm. He remembered his body being dragged to the bottom of the sea. He remembered the last time he felt the air draining from his lungs. And after that, nothing. Just this place. Would this be the end? Could this be the fate of those who are carried away by the waters? He clenched his fists. His heart was pounding. He still felt his own breathing, still felt the life force pulsing within him. If you were dead, you shouldn't be feeling all this, should you? A distant sound broke the silence. He stopped immediately, holding his breath. It was a subtle sound, almost imperceptible, but it was there. One step, a movement. Was anyone other than him there? His eyes swept the horizon. Nothing. No shadows, no silhouettes. Just that surreal scenario that seemed to have no end. but he knew he wasn't alone. His heart raced. He didn't understand what was happening, but one thing was certain. That place was not common. It was not a simple piece of land. It was a secret location, a place that shouldn't exist. And if it shouldn't exist, then why was it there? Now I want to know. What do you think happened? How did he survive? Write in the comments, the impossible happened, if you believe that miracles can occur in ways that no one can explain. The silence around him was so profound, it was overwhelming. Every beat of his heart seemed to echo in the immensity of that place, and the absence of any other sound only added to the mystery. He didn't know where he was, he didn't know how he got there, and most disturbingly, I didn't know if I was alive or dead. What was that place? The wind wasn't blowing. Time seemed to not exist. The sky, dyed in golden and bluish tones, remained motionless, like a divine painting that never changed. The ground beneath his feet was firm, but it was not earth, nor stone, nor sand. It was as if he was made of something he couldn't describe, something that didn't belong in the world he knew. He took a few more, hesitant, steps. The sound of his own feet seemed to be the only sound present. His chest rose and fell rapidly, not because he was tired, but because his breathing was ragged with anxiety. He was not alone. I could feel it. There was a presence there. He saw nothing, no one, but I felt it. Something invisible but real, something that filled that place in an inexplicable way. It wasn't fear. It was not the kind of presence that caused anguish, despair, or danger. It was something different, something he had never experienced before. And then he felt a shiver run across his skin. His entire body froze for an instant. His eyes widened. Someone was there. He turned his head slowly. His heart seemed to have stopped beating for a moment, as if it had forgotten its function for a brief second. And that's when he saw it. A short distance away there was someone standing. The figure was silent, motionless, watching him. His heart raced. He didn't know who he was, but at the same time, he knew. It was a certainty that was born within him without explanation, without reasoning, as if your spirit recognized it before your mind could even understand it. Jesus. Time seemed to actually stop. Everything else disappeared. There were no more doubts, no more questions, only he, standing, looking directly at him with a look that seemed to pierce his soul. And in that moment, he realized something he had never felt before. Everything inside him calmed down. The fear, the anguish, the despair that suffocated him as he drowned in the sea. Everything dissipated like fog before the sun. He wanted to talk. I wanted to ask. I wanted to know what was happening, but he couldn't say anything. His mouth was dry, his mind unable to form words. Jesus stepped forward. His feet touched that ground that wasn't ground, but he didn't make any noise as he moved. It felt like it was part of that place, as if it had been there forever. His face was calm, serene. His gaze carried something he couldn't describe. It was compassion. It was love. But it was something more, something that made your chest tighten and your soul tremble. Then Jesus spoke. "Are you afraid?" The voice was not loud, but it resonated within him like thunder, as if it had gone through his skin, his bones, and directly touched his spirit. The fisherman opened his mouth, but was unable to respond. The fear, yes, he was afraid. He had been afraid his entire life, from scarcity, storm, hunger, failure, death. But there, before Jesus, all these things seemed small. Jesus took another step forward. His eyes were firm but full of tenderness. "Did the storm scare you?" He swallowed hard. Yes, the storm had terrified his soul. He had never felt so small, so powerless. He, who had spent his entire life sailing, knowing the waters, facing waves, had been destroyed by that storm. He had been defeated. Jesus continued looking at him, as if waiting for an answer that didn't need to be spoken. The fisherman lowered his head. His hands were shaking. His chest rose and fell rapidly. He felt a lump in his throat. I didn't know if it was fear, shame, or something I had never felt before. I thought I was going to die." His voice was lower than expected, almost a whisper. Jesus did not respond immediately, just watched. The silence lasted for what seemed like forever. Then he said something that made your heart stop for a moment. "What if I told you that you died?" The fisherman felt a chill go up his spine. He died. His hands balled into fists. His gaze strayed to his own body. He felt everything. The ground beneath your feet, the air moving in and out of your lungs. But would he really be alive? He swallowed hard. The silence around him weighed like never before. "Am I dead?" His voice was shaky. Jesus stepped forward. His gaze was not one of judgment, but one of understanding. "You didn't understand." The fisherman frowned. He didn't understand. His mind was conflicted. Then Jesus spoke again. "You have been swallowed by the storm, but now it's here. What does this mean for you?" He tried to respond, tried to find a logic, but there wasn't. I did not know how it got there. All he remembered was the sea pulling him down. And then, emptiness. How was he there? His body trembled, but it wasn't out of fear. It was something different, something I couldn't name. Jesus came a little closer. Now he was before him, so close that he could see every detail of his face. Jesus' eyes carried something inexplicable, a love he had never felt before. "You are afraid because you don't understand. But what if I told you that you don't need to understand? Just trust." That sentence pierced his soul. Just trust. He spent his entire life trying to survive, trying to control situations, trying to do everything for yourself. But now, in front of Jesus, everything he knew, everything he believed, didn't seem to matter. A tear ran down his face without him noticing. He had never felt so small. He's never felt so protected. He had never felt so alive. The silence around him felt deeper than anything he had ever experienced. His mind was a whirlwind of unanswered questions, but at the same time, inside his heart, something was beginning to change. Before, all he knew was fear, the feeling of being at the mercy of the waves, of being just a fragile man in the face of nature's uncontrollable fury. But now, he was there, alive, whole, before Jesus. How was this possible? He blinked a few times, trying to take in the reality around him. The ground beneath his feet still felt solid, but it wasn't like the earth he knew. The sky above had soft, golden hues, as if the sun was eternally setting. The air was light, and there was a peace he had never felt before. But most impressive of all was the presence of Jesus before him, as real as anything he had ever touched. So close that he could see the details of his face, but at the same time, so far from any human explanation. The storm swallowed him. He knew that. He remembered the moment the water took over his body, pulled him to the bottom, taking the last drop of air from his lungs. He remembered the crushing weight of the water and the despair of knowing there was no escape. He should have died, but it was there. He was saved, but not in the way I expected. His eyes met Jesus's. The storm didn't destroy it. The storm brought him there. What did this mean? His knees began to weaken. The weight of that revelation fell upon him like a burden his human mind could not comprehend. He spent his entire life believing the storm was the end. But what if the storm was just the way? Jesus remained standing still, taking his time, as if he was waiting for him to come up with the answer on his own. And he began to understand. The storm was never about destroying you. It was about transforming him. His heart sped up. He remembered all the storms he had ever faced in his life, the nights without fish, without food to take home, the days of extreme tiredness where your body ached and your soul felt heavy, the losses he faced, the disappointments, the moments when he thought God had forgotten about him. He always saw these things as signs that he was being punished. But what if all these storms were just God's ways of leading him to something greater? Now do you understand? Jesus' voice sounded soft but firm. The fisherman took a deep breath. "I should be dead." Jesus inclined. his head slightly. "But you are here." The fisherman felt a shiver run down his spine. That storm didn't come to destroy him. She came to take him to a secret location. His eyes filled with tears. He spent his entire life believing that his strength was enough, that his knowledge of the sea, the winds, the nets, life was enough to survive. But now he saw how wrong he had always been. He never had control of anything. He never had power over the waters, over tomorrow, over life itself. It took being swallowed by the storm for him to understand. The silence between him and Jesus lasted a few moments, but it wasn't an empty silence. It was a silence full of meaning. "Sometimes the storm doesn't come to sink us," Jesus said, taking a step forward, "but to take us to a place where only I can transform you." Those words made his heart stop for a moment. He never thought of the storm like that. He had never considered the possibility that the strong winds, the thunder, the raging waves could be exactly what he needed. But now it made sense. If it weren't for the storm, he would never have gotten there. If it weren't for despair, he would never have looked beyond himself. If it weren't for fear, he would never have understood that alone it was impossible to survive. Tears fell down his face, but he didn't bother wiping them away. For the first time, he realized that all the storms in his life had a purpose. Nothing had been in vain. His heart ached, but it was a different kind of pain. It wasn't the pain of loss. It was pain from something being ripped away from him, something he had carried for a long time but never realized was imprisoning him, the illusion that he was in control. Now he understood. He looked at Jesus again. He no longer needed to ask why he was there. He knew the answer. The storm didn't destroy it. The storm brought him to God. And if that was true, then maybe every other storm in his life had been part of that plan too. Jesus didn't need to say anything else. He just watched him with the same look of compassion and love. The fisherman, who was previously a strong and confident man, felt his body give way. He fell to his knees before Jesus, not because he was weak, but because for the first time, I was truly free. Now I want to know, have you ever been through a storm that ultimately took you to a better place? Write in the comments, "The storm transformed me," if you believe that God can use even the most difficult times to lead us to something greater. The impact of the warm wind against his skin was the first thing he felt. Their lungs slowly expanded, as if they were taking their first breath in a long time. The smell of salt water entered his nose, familiar but different. Something had changed. He blinked a few times, his eyes still heavy, his mind fuzzy. He felt the weight of his own body on something solid, a firm but uneven ground. Little by little, reality began to take shape around him. Sand. His body was lying on the sand. He moved his fingers, feeling the fine grains between them. The heat of the sun warmed his face, bringing a strange sensation, as if he were waking up from a deep dream. But that wasn't a dream. He knew that. His heart sped up. He stood up with effort, his muscles still weak, as if they had lost their strength. His clothes were wet, but not like before. They were not heavy with salt water, soaked by the despair of a storm. They were just damp, as if he had been bathed in morning dew. He looked around. The sea was there, calm. Small waves came and went, sliding gently over the sand. The sky clear, without a trace of the fury he remembered. No clouds overhead, no thunder, no screaming wind. It was as if the storm had never existed. But he knew it existed. His chest rose and fell rapidly. His breathing was heavy, not because of tiredness, but because of something deeper, the shock of reality. He ran his hands over his face, feeling his warm skin, his rough beard, his furrowed brow. He was alive, but how? He remembered the last moment before everything disappeared. He remembered the moment the waves dragged him under, the moment the darkness swallowed him. He should have died. And yet he was there, sitting on the sand with the calm sea in front of him and the sun shining on him as if nothing had happened. The heart raced. What had happened? His eyes searched around, trying to recognize the place. He was not far from his village. He could see some small boats in the distance, the boats of fishermen who, at that time of day, should have already been returning from fishing. The light waves wet his feet, but the water didn't carry the weight of the storm. It was as if the world around him had never felt what he experienced. He stood up, his legs feeling shaky. He tried to take a few steps, but his body still seemed to get used to the weight of reality. He looked at the horizon, towards the sea. That same water that had almost destroyed him now seemed so peaceful, so harmless. How was this possible? How could the sea be two such opposite things? How could the same ocean that swallowed him be so calm now, as if it had never known fury? It was then that he understood. The storm had passed, but he was no longer the same. The wind touched his face gently, like a whisper, and he closed his eyes for a moment. The memory was still fresh, alive within him. The darkness of the waters pulling him, the void, absolute silence. And then, that place, that moment, that presence, Jesus. He took a deep breath. He felt the weight of air coming in and out of his lungs. He didn't need explanations. The impossible had happened. His eyes scanned the sea once more. Did anyone see it? Did anyone know what happened? Could it be that somewhere there was a witness to that miracle, or was that something only he had experienced? He looked at his hands. They were still shaking. Nothing seemed different in the world around him. The sun was still shining as it always did. The waves still danced gently as they always did. The birds still flew as they always did. But inside him, everything had changed. He knelt in the sand, unable to stand. His body was there, but his mind was still in that place, in the secret location. The moment he saw Jesus, nothing would ever be the same. He spent his entire life getting to know the sea, understanding its moods, its tides, its winds. But now he knew. He never knew anything. The storm was not a fluke. The furious wind was not a mistake. The rough sea was not just a coincidence of nature. It was a calling. It was the only way to get him to where he needed to be. He didn't know how long he stayed there, kneeling in the sand, breathing, feeling, trying to understand what could never be understood by a human mind. But he knew something inside him had been broken. Something had been rebuilt. And then he looked up at the cloudless blue sky and whispered, his voice still weak, "Thanks." The wind blew gently. As he continued to kneel in the sand, feeling the warmth of the sun on his skin, listening to the sound of the waves coming and going like a steady, peaceful rhythm. But inside him, everything was different. Something had changed irreversibly. He was no longer the same man who was swallowed by the storm. He spent his entire life believing that his strength, experience, and skill at sea were enough to guarantee his survival. But that day he saw with his own eyes that there are forces much greater than our human capacity. He faced the ocean, fought with all his strength, but was swallowed up by something he couldn't control. And it was there, at the moment when there was no longer any way out, when darkness completely enveloped him, that he finally found Jesus. How many times have you faced storms like this? Maybe your storm wasn't made of waves and thunder, but the impact was the same. Maybe it was an unexpected loss, a fear that paralyzed your life, a disappointment that destroyed your dreams, or a moment when you felt like everything was falling apart around you. How many times have you looked up to the heavens and wondered, why is this happening to me? Because that's exactly what he did. At the bottom of the sea, without strength, without hope, he felt the weight of everything he was carrying. He felt the fear of losing control, of not knowing what to do, of having no way out. But now, looking at the horizon, feeling the firm sand beneath his knees, he saw what he couldn't see before. The storm did not come to destroy it. She came to take him to the only place where he could be transformed. What if the same thing is happening to you? What if this pain, this fear, this problem that seems to have no solution is in fact the way for you to get to the place where Jesus can transform your life? The biggest mistake we can make is thinking we have control over everything, that if we try hard enough, if we plan every detail, if we are strong, nothing will reach us. But the truth is that life is unpredictable. The sea may be calm now, but suddenly the winds change, and when the storm arrives, it's impossible to fight it alone. But here's the secret. The secret is not to avoid storms. The secret is to understand that they are part of the path. The fisherman would never have found that secret location if he hadn't been swallowed by the sea. He would never have seen Jesus in such a real way if he hadn't lost control. He would never have understood the true meaning of faith if he had not reached the limit of his own strength. And that's why now he saw everything differently. The calm sea in front of him was not just a calm ocean. It was proof that God was in control all along. What if the same goes for your life? What if this pain you feel today, this storm that scares you, this fear that seems to suffocate you, is exactly what you need to find a greater purpose? Many times, God pushes us to the limit not to punish us, but to teach us to trust. In me, He allows us to weather storms because He knows that on the other side is something we could not achieve alone. Did the storm scare you? This was the question Jesus asked the fisherman. And that's the question you need to ask yourself now. Fear is natural, but what defines his story is not fear, it's trust. You may continue fighting the waves, trying to do everything yourself, thinking you need to have all the answers. Or you can understand that there is a secret place, a refuge that only Jesus can take you to. And when you get there, everything will make sense. The gentle breeze continued to blow, but now he felt something different. It was as if the wind carried with it a meaning that I hadn't noticed before. Before, it was just moving air, part of nature, something he never questioned. Now, it was a reminder that the storm had passed, and that he survived. His eyes remained fixed on the horizon, where the calm sea stretched as far as his vision could reach. How many times had he looked at that same landscape without really seeing it? How many times had I crossed those waters without understanding that every wave, every wind, every storm carried a purpose far greater than he could imagine? Now he knew. He touched the sand with his hands, feeling every little grain, every fine particle slipping between his fingers. That place was the same as always, but at the same time, it would never be the same again, because he would never be the same again. The transformation was not visible, it was inside him. And perhaps right now you are feeling something similar. Perhaps as you listen to this story, some memory arose, some storm from the past, some pain that made you question everything. Maybe you felt like you were drowning and that there was no way out. But what if you look back now? What do you see? Maybe that storm wasn't exactly what brought you here. Wasn't it there in that moment of despair that something began to change inside you? Could it be that in the midst of chaos, God was already preparing you for something much greater? Think about it. And now I want to know, have you ever experienced something inexplicable like this? A moment that changed you forever? Something that, at the time, seemed like the end, but then led you to a new beginning? Tell us in the comments, because your story can inspire other people. I'm sure this message touched you and awakened something inside your heart. So share with someone who needs to hear this today. How many people around you could be weathering storms without knowing there is a greater purpose? And to continue receiving more stories like this, subscribe to the channel right now and activate the bell, because there are many more hidden truths waiting to be revealed, and I want you to be part of this community. The storm has passed, but the transformation continues. But that wasn't the only inexplicable miracle. What happened to this man was just one of the many ways that Jesus intervened in people's lives in a supernatural way. There are other reports that defy any logical explanation, events so mysterious that to this day they leave scholars and believers without definitive answers. And in the next video, I'll tell you about another surprising event, something that will challenge everything you think you know about Jesus' miracles. A hidden story, little spoken of, but which has a deep meaning and can transform the way you see faith. Then click on the video below and continue this journey with me, because some stories cannot be forgotten, and this one in particular will move you in ways you never imagined. The hidden stories of Jesus.